Let me take you back some 200 years. In 1805, England, or Great Britain, was engaged in perhaps the most terrible war that England had faced in her entire history. At that time, there was a military ruler of Europe. He was the leader of the forces of the French Revolution. His name was Napoleon Bonaparte. And in fact, he was conquering all of Europe. In addition to France, he had taken the Netherlands, and he had invaded Germany, and he was in the process of defeating the two great German states, Prussia and Austria. He had intimidated Russia, that sought to make a treaty of peace with him. He had occupied all of Italy, arrested the Pope, the whole thing. He was in charge. And the only power left that was prepared to defy him was Great Britain, the English. The English had been historic enemies of the French. That's one of the themes of this story this morning. The English have, and I've mentioned this before, at least 85 different names for the French, none of which I can repeat here. It's true they fought with the French against the Germans, but they're historic enemies. The English and the French never became allies until the beginning of the 20th century. They were always fighting each other and hating each other. So the war with Napoleon was only a continuation of this historic ethnic war between the English and the French. And it looked to many observers that the French would win. He had taken all of Europe. Napoleon was not Hitler, but his conquest resembled it because he conquered all of Europe. And in fact, in World War II, it was England that stood against the Germans alone for an entire year. So people were saying, no, they'll never make it. But the British won. And ultimately, the Duke of Wellington would stand triumphant on the fields of Waterloo. Napoleon was finished. He was shipped off to die of mercury poisoning or something on an island called St. Helena's. Finished. So it was a great victory, and out of it would come an important political reality. The victory of the British over Napoleon demonstrated that the greatest political power in the world was Great Britain. She now ruled the seas, and she dominated large parts of the land. And what emerged in the 19th century, the symbol of power, because Britain was the hegemonic power in the world, was the empire. The empire. The British Empire, which covered 1/4 of the surface of the land on this planet, but much more, because the British, through their navy, controlled the oceans. So, since the oceans are the overwhelming majority of the surface of the planet, 2/3 of the planet was under the control of the British. And in the 19th century, there was no power that could challenge her. If anybody tried to, the British brought their navy. Boom, 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 finished them off. You didn't pay your debts to them, they came with their navy. They took care of you. And the symbol of the great success of the British Empire in the 19th century was this little woman who has more statues than anybody else in the world, in the history of humanity. Her name was Queen Victoria. She was, quite frankly, rather ordinary, but she was lucky. She became the Queen of England when England was at the height of its power, and certainly in British memory. There lingers this time when England was the ruler of the world. Now, the foundation of this empire lay in things that happened before. The foundation of the empire lay in an island, a little itsy-bitsy island. It is amazing that a people living on this little itsy-bitsy island could go out to conquer the world. The island lies generally above 50 degrees latitude, which is north of Winnipeg. Edinburgh is at the same latitude as Edmonton, Alberta. What keeps England possible is something coming out of the Gulf of Mexico. We call it the Gulf Stream. It warms the coast of England and makes the temperature there far different from the temperatures of Winnipeg or Western Canada. So there's this island where it rains all the time. The foundation of the empire lay in a people, one of the most extraordinary nations in the history of humanity. They're the English. They have to be. I'm speaking their language to you right now, and you speak it to me. And today it's the language of internet, which means it's the what? The language of the world, not just the language of England. Speak English and you can go anywhere in the world and they will understand you. This was a little people on a little island. And they had come over in dribbles from northern Germany in the 5th century AD, and they settled on this island. The third were the people. Something unique happened to England in the 14th century after the Black Death, the terrible plague, and the shrinking of the English population. The English peasantry developed in a way that the rest of European peasants did not develop. We call them yeomen. Yeomen are free farmers. Peasants are normally what? Serfs working for lords on the manor. But in England, because of the shortage of labor, the peasantry rose in status, and in fact, the political future of England was to be based on these rather autonomous farmers who did not brook dictatorial governments too easily, and who ultimately would turn into the foundation as they moved to the cities of the English middle class. One of the foundations was this great city called London, which in the late Middle Ages was already the largest city in Europe. Larger than Paris, larger than Rome. Its size was dependent on something that the people on this island had learned: trade and commerce. Already by the end of the Middle Ages, a very large middle class had emerged in England, engaged initially in the trade, where they were shipping English wool to the Netherlands, where it was turned into clothing, but later on, some of this clothing would be manufactured on this island itself. And what came about was a kind of transformation. England began to move from being a farm culture into being a trading and commercial culture, which was the source of wealth. One of the foundations of the empire was a monarchy, which today is not in good shape. I mean, I don't even know whether it's going to last. With Charles around, it may not. So, but the monarchy at one time was an extraordinary management system for England. The height of the monarchy was in the 16th century, when a family called the Tudors ruled. And you have people like Henry VIII or Elizabeth I, and they were extraordinary managers. And they were able to take the English and to make them a successful and important people in Europe. One of the foundations of the empire was the Protestant religion. In the 16th century, England went Protestant, and England became the champion in Europe of the Protestant cause. For that reason, she stood against the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and the Austrians, who were the leaders of the Catholics. And the great battle that would determine the future of England was the defeat of the Spanish Armada in the year 1588. One of the foundations was the Great Revolution of 1688, which led to the overthrow of a dictatorial king and the replacement of monarchical government by parliament. So it's in England that the first vestiges of what we call, or the first signs of what we call liberal democracy began. Not in the French Revolution. The French Revolution turned into a dictatorship under Napoleon. It was the English who invented a form of government which we have inherited. America is the daughter of England. We have inherited that government. It's a government based on Parliament or Congress or elected representatives of the people. One of the foundations of the empire was the Enlightenment. The English in the 18th century embraced with great enthusiasm the new age of science. And the new age of science was to transform England. England was to become the first center of the Industrial Revolution. So it was in England that the transformation of our planet by the age of science began. She was ahead of everybody else, and that was one of the sources of her power. And of course, at the foundation of the empire lay her most important military instrument, which was not her army. The most important military instrument of the English was the Navy, the control of the seas. And nobody in the 19th century, once Napoleon was defeated, nobody could defeat the British Navy. It was the British Navy that helped to defeat Napoleon, imposing a blockade on Europe so that there would be no access to the resources that were beyond Europe. Now, all of this was reinforced by things that happened in the 19th century. One, as I mentioned, was the development of the Industrial Revolution. England became a manufacturing nation. Today we wear most clothing, it's made in China. I don't know. But in the 19th century, most clothing was made in England. There was Manchester. It was reinforced by the development of a banking system, which provided the fuel for the Industrial Revolution all over the world. London became the center of money. If you wanted money, I mean big, not a little money, but if you wanted big money, the place you went to was London. That was the center of money and finance in the world. It was reinforced by a culture of power. The English personality is different from the personalities of oppressed people. They never really experience what? Oppression. They experienced success. And so the English personality reflected it. It reinforced everything. It's the British personality before the Beatles. No, it's the stiff upper lip. Do you remember? The aristocratic person. The captain who doesn't even say oi when he goes down on his ship. I mean, and in fact, so great and powerful was that culture that in the 19th century and in the 20th and still in the 21st century, people who want their children to develop what we call aristocratic manners, they ship them to England. And it was reinforced by political stability. England didn't have any of the turmoil that France did or Germany with dictatorial governments being overthrown. Once the parliamentary system was established, there was a stable balance made between the upper classes and the middle classes, and in fact, there were arguments and disagreements. But like the United States of America, the English government has remained, it's stable. We don't have any military coups. And of course, it was reinforced by the fact that hundreds of thousands if not millions, of Englishmen left their country to go out and live elsewhere. How else do you explain the United States of America? They're the founding race, the founding nation of the United States of America, of Canada, in Australia, of New Zealand, just go on. And they also went by the thousands and hundreds of thousands to India, which they conquered. So they went out, and the success of their empire was that all these people moved out to be the controlling force of this empire, whether in Africa or in the Americas or in Asia. Now, this empire had obviously problems. First of all, in England itself, there were those people who became very, very wealthy by all this power. They were the upper classes and the middle classes. But once the Industrial Revolution arrived, there now emerged the working class. The working class in England often lived in terrible slums. They couldn't even breathe through the pollution of London and the other cities. They were told they were English and should be proud that they ruled the world, but they didn't feel it. They were living in a what? In a dirty slum, in a dirty part of London, and they had no money, and they had no economic security. So one of the problems that arose in England was the resentment of the lower classes against the upper. The wealth, the new wealth, was not evenly distributed. One of the problems was the cost of the empire. Large parts of the British Empire were not economically productive. Most of the places that the British were in Africa cost more than the wealth they produced. The reason the British hung on to them was because of prestige. They wished to be the greatest power in the world. It was not economically and financially rational. They even ran out of people to ship out to control this vast empire. They were too small a country. The third was that many of the people they conquered started to rebel, especially in India, which was the jewel of the crown of the British Empire. There was this little man who ultimately got the name Mahatma Gandhi, and he gave the British like heart attacks. I mean, a coronary condition. Churchill hated him. One of the problems, of course, was political dissent. The British political system had consisted of two parties, a party of the upper classes called the Conservatives, and a party of the middle classes called the Liberals. And they dominated English politics. They're the ones who got the wealth, right? But at the beginning of the 20th century, there would now appear a party that was the party of the working class, who didn't like either the middle class or the aristocracy. They couldn't tell the difference. And that party had a name, which is not illogical. Because they embraced the ideas of socialism, they could have been called the Socialist Party. That's what these parties were called all over Europe. But instead, because the British always have to be different, they called themselves the Labour Party, right? It's called the Labour Party. The Labour Party was the party of the lower classes. Now, the leadership of the Labour Party was not the lower classes because they did not have the skills for organizing a party. So they found what I would call intellectuals. Intellectuals are generally the children of the middle class who want to overthrow their parents. We had that experience in the 60s. So they're the children of the middle class. They're well educated. They now ally themselves with the what? With the working class. They provide them with a kind of intellectual elite. And now they're mobilized. And now there emerges in the early 20th century a third party in England against both the Liberals and the Conservatives called the Labour Party. By that time, the English government, the Parliament, has been forced to grant universal suffrage, which means one person, one vote, which of course was very dangerous for the upper classes and the middle classes, but it was unavoidable. One of the major problems for England was that at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, she found competitors. Her chief competitor for power in the 19th century was a big country that was underdeveloped in terms of the Industrial Revolution. That country was Russia. England was to go to war with Russia in the middle of the 19th century. It was called the Crimean War. But at the end of the 19th century, the Russian economy wasn't doing very well. And in fact, Russian power declined, and a new power arose that challenged England. It was a strange development because the royal family of this country was related to the English royal family. The Kaiser of Germany was the grandson of Queen Victoria. His mother was the daughter of Queen Victoria. And after all, the English royal family had come from Germany. Victoria spoke German as well as she spoke English. So it's rather strange. And racially and ethnically, they were what? Connected and related. And culturally, there were many, many similarities because the Germans had also embraced the Industrial Revolution, and their wealth was greatly increasing. The Kaiser made a mistake. Instead of allying himself with England against the Russians, he decided to create a navy as big as the British, something the British could not allow. So that was to trigger a conflict between Germany and England, which would lead to what is described as the First World War. Now, that war was to be the beginning of the collapse of the British Empire. In fact, the English today live with the memories of the empire, but they don't live with the power of that empire because the empire is gone. It's finished. The sign of the decay was a little war that was fought at the beginning of the 20th century with the Dutch in South Africa, which was to have lasted for 3 weeks and lasted for 3 years. The Boer War, but it was the First World War in which 1 million Englishmen were killed. Got it? It was absolutely and totally devastating. This country was not big enough to handle the loss. The human cost and the financial cost of the war revealed the weakness of England. In the end, the British Empire was rescued by one of its daughters, the United States of America. And without American intervention, it is not clear that the Germans themselves would have been defeated. So, the collapse begins, the First World War. After the First World War, the British are beginning to lose their empire. The Indians are in a massive rebellion. The British don't have enough troops to keep the rebellion down. Does it sound familiar? No. And then the Depression hits, which undermines the financial stability of England. By the early 1930s, the English have to stop calling the empire. They now call it the Commonwealth of Nations, granting equality in some cases to some of the colonies that were part of that empire. And then came the Second World War. The Second World War ended with a British victory. But when 1945 rolled around, London was what? Had been bombed to death. And so had dozens of other English and British cities. England was a ruin. And she had lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Her economy was a mess. She was absolutely exhausted. And again, although we admire the bravery of the English who stood against Adolf Hitler alone for an entire year, it is again clear that the only reason why the British Empire, such as it was, survived was because the United States of America intervened. Had Roosevelt not led the United States of America into the war in support of England, it is highly doubtful that the English would have defeated Adolf Hitler. And in fact, after 1945, it was certainly clear that the hegemonic power in the world was not England, it was the United States of America. So now England entered into a very difficult period. She's still in it. She's trying to figure out who and what she is. I mean, you're at the top of the world. I mean, you're ruling the world, and now you're not even what we would call on the second tier. You may be on the third tier or the fourth tier. So now you have to, adjust. It's like people I remember in the 1930s. They'd been very rich in the 1920s. They had big houses, do you understand? They had a lot of money, and then everything just collapsed. And now they had to, what? Adjust to a different kind of world. So England is still trying to do that. She went from the empire to just being a little country on a little island off the coast of Europe. The financial center of the world today is no longer London. Try New York. My prediction is it'll be Shanghai. In a short while, but I mean, we have a few years until we have to confront that reality. Well, in the interim, this party that had started at the beginning of the 20th century began to grow bigger. After all, the conservatives and liberals had suffered a great humiliation in the collapse of the British Empire. Their wealth rested on it. And the working class's expectations, especially raised by the propaganda of the First World War and the Second World War, began rising. The Labor Party grew. At the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, as the Depression struck the world, the first Labor government took over in England. The Prime Minister was a rather ineffectual person. He was a good politician on the stump, but he was not a good manager. His name was Ramsay MacDonald, and the government did not last. The Labor Party had this short triumph and then was replaced by the Conservative Party under Stanley Baldwin. But the Labor Party kept growing because the Depression was terrible. And the plight of the working class was terrible, and many, many middle-class people fell down into what we call the working class. They, too, needed help. When the Second World War began in 1939, it was very clear that the government of England, if it was going to function in the war against the Germans, could not simply be a government run by the conservatives. By 1939, the Liberal Party had shrunk almost into oblivion. It had at one time had been the what? It was the great party of the 19th century. It shrunk into oblivion, and the conservatives were now confronted by the Labor Party. The people who had voted Liberal either went into the Conservative Party or some of them joined the Labor Party, and it was very clear in the Second World War that a unity government would have to be created. The head of the government was a conservative. His name was Winston Churchill. And Winston Churchill organized a unity government. Many members of his government were members of the Labor Party. They were fighting a shared enemy. They had to band together. And then came the great surprise. At the end of the war, this is exactly 60 years ago, 1945, there was a big conference held. Roosevelt went, Churchill went, and Stalin went to a suburb of Berlin called Potsdam. And there they held a meeting to decide what would happen to Europe. So I remember the photograph. There was Roosevelt. Roosevelt was not there. There was a great conference held. Roosevelt had died. So the man who replaced him was Harry. So Harry was there. And quite frankly, Harry at that time wasn't too sure of himself. So Harry's sitting around, but the two great ones are there, right? Churchill and Stalin. And Churchill is looking very confident in the whole thing. And in the middle of the conference, Churchill disappears. I remember the photograph changed. There was Truman, there was Stalin, and Churchill vanishes because they hold an election in England. And in fact, people expected that Churchill would be reconfirmed. Was he not one of the great war heroes, right? That the people of England would vote for. Wrong. He and his Conservative Party were defeated. And now there showed up in Potsdam this strange man. Sort of baldish, looked a little intellectual, scholarly. He was a worse speaker than Harry at that time. His name was Clement Attlee. Had anybody ever heard of him? I said, who is he? What's he doing there? Was he Churchill's butler? Trying the seat? There he is. Who is he? Well, he is the leader of the Labor Party. And unbelievably, the working class, the party representing the working class, had defeated the great hero of the Second World War. And now Clement Attlee, who was at that Potsdam conference, so now it's Truman and Attlee and Stalin, so you can figure out who ran the conference and got his way. I mean, Stalin was an old pro at this. So Attlee returned to England, and now began, I call it, the first transformation. What England is now trying to do is to adjust to being a country which is no longer the great power of the world. And in fact, the Labor Party's campaign had been about that fact. The Labor Party kept saying, why are we spending all this money on the empire, on the troops? Do you understand? We've got starving people in this country, people without education, people without health care. So we are opposed to the empire. Let the empire be flushed down the toilet. We want whatever resources are left to us after this terrible war, we want those resources directed to the working class, to the people of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Okay, fine. All right. So now came something that was almost unbelievable. The ideology of Clement Attlee and the leaders of the Labor Party was something called socialism. And socialism, as it had evolved, had a program. The program was that the ownership of the major capital resources of the country ought to be in the hands of the people. The representatives of the people are the state. So you may remember, it was like, the upper classes in England, I mean, they thought they'd won the war, but I mean, they were in deep mourning. And a large part of the middle class. They nationalized everything. The whole steel industry was taken over by the government. The trucking industry was taken over by the government. The railroads were totally taken over by the government. And in fact, they were working on taking over all of banking. If you wanted to get money, you came to the government. So in a flash, the whole foundation of the old English economy collapsed and a new foundation was created. In addition to nationalization came welfare. It was at the end of the 1940s that something called the National Health Service, right, was instituted. It's called socialized medicine. Everybody in England was now covered, right? Poor, it didn't make any difference. There was the National Health Service. All doctors worked for it. And what was also established was an education system. The education system prior to World War II had left many people out, poor people out. Now there was going to be an education system in which everybody was entitled to a free education, not only elementary school, but also high school, and also if you passed the test and qualified, even on the university level. It was a major transformation of English society. To pay for it, they had to give up what was left of the empire. In 1947, Clement Attlee surrendered India. Remember, Churchill said, over my dead body, what he said, something equivalent to that. Over my dead body will I, do you understand? Will I tolerate the dissolution of the British Empire? Forget it, Winston, you're not in charge. Clement is. So to pay for this whole new system, you had a choice. The English economy is exhausted. You have limited resources. Are you going to pay for troops patrolling an empire? Or are you going to devote it to what we call the improvement of the lives of the working class? Well, there it was. Big controversy. Now, that first transformation had a permanent effect on England. Today, if you go to England, there is still what? Socialized medicine. Even if you're conservative, you use the what? Often the public hospitals, the public clinics, whatever. I mean, there are now private supplements if you want them, but there it is, it stayed. Now, this change traumatized many Englishmen. In addition to losing their empire, they were now losing their culture. A bunch of people from the bottom had now risen up, and they were changing the country. So the Conservative Party got a new lease on life. The new lease on life was reinforced by something else. At that time, the United States of America had entered into the Cold War with Russia. And now there arose in American politics the feature of anti-communism. So, is communism a form of socialism? So the theme of anti-communism also entered into Britain, because Britain allied itself with the United States against the Soviet Union. It was the chief ally of the United States of America in Europe against the Soviet Union. So between the anti-communism and the trauma of the change, in 1950, 5 years after Clement Attlee came to power, Winston Churchill, still smoking cigars, living proof that what all the doctors told him was wrong, returns to power. Just in time, by the way, to be around for the coronation of the new queen, right? I mean, because George VI will die and Elizabeth II will come to power. So now Churchill comes to power. It's part of what I call the first resistance. These were people who said, we can't give up what we were. So when the Conservatives returned to power, they denationalized steel. The whole steel industry had 5 years before what? Been nationalized. Now the Conservatives say, give it back to private enterprise. They sold it off to private enterprise. And they took the trucking industry, which they had nationalized, and they what? Go, private enterprise. We're going to return it. And what we're going to do is we're going to hang on to whatever empire we have. We had to give up India and Pakistan, but we're going to hang on to our empire. That's who we are. That's our English identity. And the sign of that was Churchill got older, and he decided to go into painting. No, whatever. He was too old to continue his management of the country, so he was ultimately replaced by a man who was sent by central casting for British prime ministers. I mean, Hollywood couldn't have found anybody better. Anthony Eden, remember? And in fact, it was in 1956, this was all part of the first resistance. These people were saying, no, 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 you're not going to take away from us our empire. In Egypt, there was a very valuable British possession. It was called the Suez Canal. That's how you get to India. And Nasser decided to take it over. Now, in 1880, when the Egyptian government failed to pay their debts to the British banks, a British Navy showed up off the coast of Egypt and went boom, boom, and what? Invaded the country and took it over. Stayed for 60 years. But that didn't seem possible in 1956. Well, lo and behold, Eden conspires with Guy Mollet, who is the Prime Minister of France, who's having trouble in Algeria with Arabs, and the Israelis who are having trouble with Arabs, right? And now British paratroopers are coming down over the Suez. Do you remember this whole thing? Well, 1956 is the turning point in what I call British self-awareness. Dwight D. Eisenhower called up Anthony Eden. And he said, I'm not sure what he said directly, but I'm going to paraphrase it. He said, I think you're confused. The power that's in charge of the world now is not England. It's the United States of America. And we have valuable oil resources in the Middle East. And we're not prepared to lose them. And we're fighting a Cold War or a hot war with the Soviet Union. And in fact, if we disturb what's happening now in the Muslim world, then most of it is going to turn to the side of the Soviet Union. So get out. Now, most historians date the true collapse of the British Empire to 1956. It was very clear after 1956 that what? England was finished. All Eisenhower had to do was call up on the telephone, and they pulled out. The French pulled out, well, of course. The Israelis pulled out, yes. But the British? Humiliating. Now, what followed the first resistance, because the conservative government came, tumbling down, and in fact, Eden was followed by a conservative whose name was Macmillan, who was much annoyed by something that was happening in Europe. Whom do the English hate? The French. The French had now, having lost Algeria, decided to make up with the Germans. And the Americans were helping them do it because the Americans wanted the West Germans and the French to cooperate against the Soviet Union. And out of it came an idea of Europe. Why can't we bind all the nations, do you understand, of Western Europe together in one great union that will stand against the Soviet Union? And the leaders of the campaign in Europe were the French. And now, who can believe it? The Germans and the French are very cozy. And they're talking to each other. And they create what is called the European Common Market, which includes France, Germany, Holland, Belgium, and Italy, and a little thing called Luxembourg. All right. Well, the English are asked to join it. But you have to understand the conservative mentality. Most Englishmen do not believe they're part of Europe. Europe is something that belongs to foreigners. They're across the what? The English Channel. There is England, don't you understand? We should join a union organized by you. British public opinion was opposed to joining it. And the conservative government reinforced it. So Macmillan said no. In fact, he tried to organize a different kind of union called the European Free Trade Agreement, which they got the Swedes in it and the Austrians, the whatever. It was kind of a loose connection. Well, the British Empire was certainly finished. So what now would follow, and Europe is beginning to grow. The French and Germans are beginning to really develop their respective economies. West Germany is turning into an economic miracle, while England lies basically an economic ruin. So what will follow is the second transformation. The second transformation is the one that I can't believe. When I first saw the Beatles, I could not believe they were English. Did they come from Tennessee? I mean, were they somewhere from Kentucky? Is that Englishmen do not behave, do you understand, like the Beatles. There's no mere coincidence. The Beatles followed the defeat in 1956. The English are now trying to adjust, do you understand, who and what they are. So being upper class and powerful, well, that's over. And in fact, the music of the Beatles is a kind of beginning of an age of a new kind of egalitarianism, a new kind of pursuit of pleasure, whatever it was. It was England after the humiliation. So there they are. By the way, today, if you want to talk about the second transformation, if you want your soccer game ruined by rioters, you invite the English. There are parts of the world who they will not allow English, do you understand? English people to show up. They'll come in and they riot. So all the good manners, do you understand, that we associate with what we call the English, it's gone. Finished. The second transformation was the cultural transformation in the 1960s, and now the 60s start up, and the Beatles are part of it, and now figures from England are leaders against what we call the good manners of the aristocracy, the English. So obviously the conservatives will fall from power, and now the Labor Party returns in the 1960s. The Conservative Party tried to hold back the flood, and they failed. Now, who's the head of the Labor Party? Well, he's a charming guy with white hair. His name is Harold Wilson. Does anybody remember Harold Wilson? He was the Prime Minister of England. He came to power in 1964 after a terrible scandal in the Macmillan government, which featured a member of his cabinet called Profumo. Do you remember Profumo? Oh, Oh, is that how the upper classes behave? I mean, give me the... All right, so the scandal was there, and in comes Harold Wilson, and now the Labor... Of course, the Labor Party's perfect. The self-image of the English is no longer that we are the what? The great power of the world, so we don't have to behave the way we used to. And when Wilson comes back to power, I'll tell you what they do. They renationalize steel. So if you work in the steel industry, you don't know who's in charge. First, private industry owns it. Then the government owns it. Then private industry owns it. Then the what? Then the government. I mean, the whole thing. But he can't renationalize most of the stuff that was denationalized. The mood of the people in the 1960s is different. The economy is beginning to improve. But what the Labor Party does is they finish off the empire. In the 1960s, they free all their colonies with the exception of Hong Kong and Bermuda. Just gone. All those colonies in Africa, right? In the 1960s, they're what? Ghana, Nigeria, the Sudan, whatever, they're all go. You're free, liberated. When they do that, there's a consequence. When the new governments take over their colonies, there are hundreds of thousands of people who had been collaborators with the British. And now the new governments are harassing them. So where are they going to go? They want to go to England. Isn't England their friend? Didn't they work for England? Didn't they risk their lives? So now, arriving by plane into Heathrow is the New England. We got Indians, we got Pakistanis, we got Nigerians, we got all, you got it? They're all arriving. It's the 1960s, and now the face of London and the face of England is changed. There's not enough room in London. They're up in Sheffield, they're up in Bradford, whatever else it is. There are whole towns in England that now develop a population, the majority of which isn't even English. So in addition to the loss of good manners and what we call the upper class image, and an economy that isn't so terrific, certainly not as good as the French and the Germans, into England now come hundreds of thousands of people who are culturally different. I remember once way back, I had to stay at Heathrow waiting for a plane, and I can't stand just sitting idly. So I decided to walk around the area. I walked for miles, I want to tell you. It was a Pakistani ghetto. It's surrounded. I mean, I was looking for the English, the whole thing, but I didn't find the English. The country was being transformed. Now we understand that in America because we've had all these population, changes and so forth. But for England, it was absolutely new. So with the Beatles, do you understand, and the loss of power comes this racial change. So the second transformation is a major transformation of England. By the time you reach the end of the 1970s, and the Labor Party sort of hangs in there through most of this period of time, they're back. There is in England a malaise, a sense that they're going down. Just, do you understand? They were humiliated, they lost their empire, they were in charge, and the whole thing. And then comes the second resistance. The second resistance was led by a woman, one of the most extraordinary women, not only in the history of England. I mean, they should have made her the queen. At least she had good management skills. All right. And she would have taken Charles, although her son has misbehaved, I must say. All right. So maybe her family skills aren't that good. But she was extraordinary. She came to power in 1979 as the morale of the country was sinking, as the English economy was harassed by inflation. And everybody was saying, oh, the French and the Germans, oh, they're going up. During the second transformation under the Labour Party, England was allowed in to Europe. Allowed in, do you understand? They had applied 10 years before and were rejected. De Gaulle, who hated the English, took great pleasure in calling them up and saying, "You're not in." But he was finished by the early 1970s. They got in, but it was humiliating. They were just England let in? So in 1979, she arrived. She was a middle-class woman. She didn't like to be called a feminist, but she certainly was what? She certainly was. Her name was Maggie Thatcher. And you may remember her. She's one of the most extraordinary political figures of the 20th century. And if I try to think of a female political figure in the 20th century, I mean, two come to mind. There's Indira Gandhi in India, right? I mean, I'm talking about a significant figure. And quite frankly, she failed at transforming India. Maggie Thatcher came to power, and again, she's part of that group, you have to understand. It's this group of people represented by the Conservative Party that they don't want to give up what England was. So Maggie Thatcher isn't very enthusiastic about being part of Europe. And one of the reasons she's not too enthusiastic is because the French and Germans by then have developed enormously expensive welfare systems. In order to maintain peace between workers and management, the peace was brought about by an agreement. The agreement was that the workers would be well taken care of. And so they developed a system in France and Germany, which certainly worked for a long while, where they received enormous benefits. In some cases, the vacation was 9 weeks, the extreme case. In one of the cases, retirement was at 50 if you wanted it. 9 weeks vacation, do you understand? And it was a system where you had complete coverage in terms of your health. The system was for the worker wonderful. She wasn't enthusiastic about it because that same system to some degree had been implemented with fewer resources in England. And she had an idea. It was an idea that would later on be imitated by Ronald Reagan. The idea was that the only way to get this economy moving, the only way to restore English prestige, was to cut taxes and shrink welfare. So, and restore the educational system to where it was before. The old system was an elitist system. It's a system I grew up in America. In junior high school, we had the kids divided up into the smart kids in one homeroom.
Thousands of women will lose a child to AIDS simply because they didn't get an HIV test when they were pregnant. You see, there's now treatment that can help stop the spread of HIV from mother to baby, which gives children of HIV-infected mothers something they never had before: a chance. If you're pregnant, please get an HIV test.
In another homeroom. Do you remember that system? It's an elitist system, and everybody knew where your homeroom was, right? Was it number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4? Do you remember that system? The whole thing, okay. Fine. That's an elitist system, and England pretty much had that, whereby there were certain schools for the less talented and certain schools for the more talented. the Labor government in the Second Transformation had changed the system to create a universal system in which all children, regardless, do you understand, of IQs, talent, doesn't make any difference, were put into the same room. That happened also in the United States of America, with resulting fall and collapse to some degree of educational standards. So now Thatcher says, we're going to change it back. We're going to improve it. So now comes the Thatcher Revolution. The Thatcher Revolution is get the government out of business. Sell everything. Oh, sell everything. Well, sell the steel industry. Sell the railroads. The railroads? Yes, privatize the railroads. Everything. No more government in business. Cut the taxes. She moved the upper rate, in some cases, the upper rate for very wealthy people in England, an income tax was close to 95%. It was almost what we would call confiscatory, instituted by the Labor Party. It was cut down to one half. It was cut down to like 48%. That would be regarded in this country also as confiscatory, but by the English standards, it was already like an improvement. I mean, she cut the taxes, and if you tried to stand in her way, she was the Iron Lady. Relentless. It was the great second resistance. And you could see how she appealed to the British people, because she said, we're still great. And the sign of it was when the Argentinian government, the junta, desperate to hang on to power, decided that they would take a few little islands off the coast of Argentina with a few Scotsmen and a lot of sheep. They couldn't imagine that these islands that belonged to England would be defended by the English. So they invaded it, the Malvinas, the Falkland Islands. Well, they misunderstood Maggie Thatcher. Do you remember this? I mean, it was 1982. It was incredible. The British Empire had collapsed. The next thing you know is the British Navy is sailing. It's like the 19th century. The British Navy is sailing for the Falklands, and at the helm is Prince Andrew, looking very handsome. They finally rescuing the monarchy, and they come to the Falklands, they land, and they take care of the Argentinians, they restore the British. Who cares to own these islands? Even the sheep protest when they're shipped there. That isn't the point. Do you understand? For a brief moment, the English people felt they were still what? The empire. Do you understand? We hang on to our empire. It may be small now, but nobody better take anything from us. From 1979 to 1990, she ruled with an iron hand. Some people liked her, some people didn't like her. Even people who approved of her policy sometimes didn't like her. But she had a fairly abrasive personality. But I do want to say that this second resistance made an overwhelming change, such a change in England that the economy that was going down the tubes was revived. And in fact, by 1990 or 89, it wasn't the French and the Germans who were ahead, it was the what? The British. In fact, Ronald Reagan pointed to it when he tried to explain his policies in the United States of America economically. The French and the Germans were beginning to experience the price of the welfare state. Now, the system, however, had problems. One was Thatcher and most of the British didn't want to be part of Europe. But on the other hand, it was useful being part of Europe because that meant that British goods could what? Circulate freely all over Europe, right? and be free of trade restrictions. So there was this kind of internal contradiction. On the one hand, they liked the opportunity. On the other hand, they didn't wish to be identified with Europe. Europe was a kind of French-German plot. The second was the dichotomy. The Thatcher revival applied mainly to southern England. What happened with the removal of government help and government management was that many of the industries in northern England, which could no longer compete on the world market, turned into rusting factories. If you went up to places like Leeds, Newcastle, Manchester, Liverpool, I mean, you went to London and it was what? The greatest city in the world, and then you went up to northern England and it was an economic devastation. So there was this dichotomy which flowed from the change. The third problem was, in Europe, the model for how to deal with the working class was to shower on them all these benefits. And in fact, that would lead to a kind of abrasiveness. That is, the French and the Germans looked at the English now under Thatcher and said, that's not the way to go. One of the issues that was a continuous provocation to the English was that the French and German governments insisted, particularly the French, that they must save French farmers. And Thatcher said, why do you have to save French farmers? Let them produce, do you understand? Let them sell their stuff on the open market. If it sells, fine. If it doesn't sell, then they let them go into another business. No! Our farmers are the heart of French culture. Thank you. So now the European common market, of which the British were a part, had to pay enormous amounts of money every year to keep thousands and thousands of French farmers in their job. They're called agricultural subsidies, and the British were furious. In fact, to appease them after a while, since the British were paying out more money than they received in benefits from Europe, because their economy was improving, they received a rebate every year because they were mad, and in their minds justifiably mad. The fourth problem were the French, who became increasingly more insufferable because the French had a vision. The vision was to write a whole new constitution for Europe. And now, as the Soviet Union was beginning to fall apart and collapse, maybe ultimately to include all the nations of Eastern Europe, do you understand, in this big thing called Europe, which would mean that the British would no longer be in charge of their own affairs. They would simply become a state in Europe. Now, for somebody who owned this empire, that was unacceptable. But worse was the French thought they were going to be the people to lead it. The French had already reluctantly acknowledged that the working, well, they haven't really acknowledged it, they somehow were forced to accept it, that the working language of Europe is English. Already for that they needed shrinks shipped in from all over the world just to handle, do you understand, for the French, English. So they said, okay, you can have the language, but what? We'll run the place. So it was a source of, I must tell you, great problem. And then at the end of the 1980s, you may remember, it ultimately did Bush in, a recession, right, came. And what happened was that Thatcher got fed up with negative criticism after all she had done for her country. So she decided to resign. And she was replaced by a rather innocuous political figure, whose name you most likely don't remember, but I'll give it to you, John Major. Does anybody remember Major? Nice-looking guy. If I asked you, did he have blue eyes or brown eyes? You can't even tell me. I mean, people don't remember can't remember all the details. So he follows. The conservatives are still in power. They were the engineers of this great economic change. And where's the Labor Party? The Labor Party is nowhere. The Labor Party had presided over the economic decline of England. So now here is the great miracle story. I call it the resurrection. Now, the model for what happened is the Democratic Party in the United States of America. The Democratic Party was very smart. They used to nominate people like George McGovern, William Mundell, who are superb individuals. They cannot win an election. Then, in 1992, they nominated an interesting guy, very smart, very articulate, very charming. His name is Bill Clinton. And how did Bill Clinton win in 1992? After all, we just finished with Reagan. And then there was Bush for a term. Because, Dukakis was please. The best thing about Dukakis is his cousin, who's Olympia Dukakis, whom I like as an actress. Okay. So in 92, Clinton comes in and he says, look, the Republican Party is falling into the hands of the religious right. So I want you to know, Mr. Republican, that economically, we're going to do the same for you as the Republican Party. We're going to move the Democratic Party from the left into the center. And so that's what he proceeds to do. And he says, we believe in lower taxes, do you understand? And we believe in reforming the welfare. Do you remember Clinton? So in 92, he got elected because many people were terrified of the religious right, who'd taken over the convention in Houston. And so now, a lot of these people, independents who had voted Republican, liberal Republicans, went over and voted for Clinton because the Clinton economic policies were not very different from the Republican. Hang on to that idea. So now enter Tony Blair. He's a socialist. So he said when he joined the party. He is now the leader of the Labor Party. He's a very charming guy, young, handsome, articulate, whatever. He's a charmer. And now Tony Blair decides to take the Labor Party into a place where it had never been before. Try to imagine a socialist party endorsing the economic program of Margaret Thatcher. Got it? That's what he did. Because in his mind it worked. Shrink the welfare system, stop the strikes, cut the taxes. Is that a socialist? If that's a socialist, what's the concern? I can't tell the difference. So he did that. And in fact, in 1997, there were a series of problems and scandals. Major was essentially uninteresting. He couldn't carry out what I call the Thatcher theater. But Blair took Thatcher's economics and he attached it to what we would call a liberal view toward Europe. Yes, England should be part of Europe. We should be more active in Europe. Europe is the future of Europe and of England, the whole thing. There we are. Oh. And in 1997, he won an overwhelming victory. 436 seats for Labor, 165 for the Conservatives. Can you believe this? The humiliation. Do you remember? I mean, it was like, who could believe? Where did he come from? So now we've got a socialist party with the economics of Margaret Thatcher. Is it confusing? Well, it's a little confusing. Is it a path to success? The answer is what? Yes. They wanted a new face and a new party. They wanted a clean house. And not only that, the younger people were sick and tired of hearing Europe being denounced. And so Blair gets in. Now, I must say, he was a raging success. When he ran again in 2001, 4 years later, he got, do you understand, almost the same number of people. It was an incredible victory, 2 times in a row. But then it happened, so let me just mention what happened. From the very beginning, there were scandals. He had a friend, Peter Mandelson, who was just his buddy, but he had his finger in too many pies, and his connections were sometimes suspect, and he was forced to dismiss him. The second problem was that although he had embraced Europe, many of the people who voted for him didn't want to be intimately tied to Europe in this new plan that was being conceived by the French in particular and by the West Germans. The third was, at the time of his second election and great triumph, there was also a defeat. One of his enemies in the Labour Party, Ken Livingstone, ran to be mayor, the first mayor of London. Up until that time, London was divided up into many little cities, right? And now a kind of united London mayor. And Livingstone always said, when I joined this party, it was the Socialist Party. And now I have as the leader of my party, Margaret Thatcher dressed up like a man. I want him to leave. So Blair arranged to have an opponent challenge him, but in the end Livingstone won very easily as the mayor of London, and now this is problematic. There's a wing of the Labour Party that says we have been what? Betrayed. And they have somebody in the wings. He is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Minister of Finance. His name is Gordie Brown, and he's a nice guy. He's not as charming as Tony Blair, but he's been waiting for this job. And now there are all these people in the Labour Party who say, well, yes, he had these great victories, but he's got to be vulnerable. We've got to replace him. We've got to restore the integrity of the Labour Party. And then comes his trouble. He meets George Bush Jr. And George Bush Jr., after September the 11th, has an idea about how to defeat terrorism, whatever. First to invade Afghanistan, which certainly the British joined, and then to invade Iraq. He tells Blair that the war will be short and efficient. And he says, join me. And you have to understand, for many, many British people, there is an ambivalence. They are part of Europe, but they are culturally more attached to the United States of America. They speak English. I mean, after all, they started English in Britain. So there's this ambivalence about, well, maybe we should be allied with the United States of America than integrated into Europe. So now, building on that idea, he joins the war effort. Now, for him, that was a colossal political mistake. Because while the majority of the people in his party were willing to endorse the economics of Maggie Thatcher because a large number of them were benefiting from it, they were opposed to the war in Iraq. And now it's like, oops, oops. But once done, what? It was too late, and now a huge opposition arises in his own political party, what? Against him. And then the BBC, which belongs to the government of which he is the head, puts on a program saying that he knew there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And in fact, there is a man in the government who produces a document to show that they knew that. Then Tony Benn, in anger, outs the person. He reveals who this person was who what? Leaked the message. His name is David Kelly, and the next thing you know is David Kelly commits suicide. Do you remember the whole thing? So now they call a commission to investigate the whole thing. They get Lord Hutton, and Lord Hutton shows up and he investigates. He ultimately will exonerate Tony Blair, but the controversy won't go away. In fact, in May of this year, his third election is held. Some people think that he might not make it, but the candidate opposing him from the Conservative Party. You see, I thought Walter Mondale was chosen by the Republicans. Do you understand? That he was chosen by the Republicans because they knew that what? I mean, so Michael Howard, who was the leader of the Conservative Party, is one of the most boring, nondescript politicians ever to emerge on the political scene. They've had trouble finding a conservative leader that works. I mean, defeating Howard it doesn't take much skill. So Tony Blair wins. But not with the big majority he had in the first two elections. He's now down to 356. And if you put together the conservatives and the third party, the liberals, now called the Liberal Democrats, then you're very what? Close together. The comfortable majorities he had aren't there. So while it was viewed as a victory, his enemies said, you see, the Labor Party's going down the tubes. Get rid of Tony. Get rid of Tony. Up with Gordon Brown. Even his wife suggests they buy a house in the Bahamas. It's over. Wrong. Something will happen. This happened a little while ago. I can't wait to tell you. Something will happen that will absolutely and totally reverse his fortunes and turn him again into a hero. And if you'll come back in 5 minutes, I'll tell you.
They've given our generation a label. X. Generation Nothing. They say we have no sense of purpose. They say we have no war to fight and no cause to believe in. Who are they? Join the thousands of us who are making a difference and wear a label that does mean something.
Well, let me just look at the realities of England now. Britain today is, not in all areas, but on the whole, one of the more prosperous countries in Europe. It's doing far better than France or Germany, who are now suffering a massive unemployment and political paralysis, because it is very clear that no politician in France or Germany can win an election who is prepared to dismantle the welfare system. Got it? So now everybody is outsourcing. And in fact, France and Germany are receiving almost no new investment. So England, which was at the bottom, is now ahead, based on, to some degree, the work of Maggie Thatcher and Tony Blair, because Tony Blair is a socialist who follows the policies of Maggie Thatcher. Okay. So we've got, I call it Thatcher socialism. I like that phrase. I call it Thatcher socialism because that's what it is. His party is split. It's split on two issues. The old issue, and the most important one, is the economics one. There are many people, there was Tony Benn, one of the leaders of the labor left, hates his guts. The Labor Party has repudiated its history. It was there to serve the working class, and in fact it was there to create a socialist economy, and it was there to create the welfare state, and now the welfare state's being cut, and the socialist economy, it's down the tubes. Everybody's on his own. Big competitive world there. The second issue, which was handed to them, Tony Blair thought that joining George Bush Jr. would redound to his benefit. In the end, he got caught up in a war which has alienated most of the members of his party, most of the people who voted for him. And there was no way with any kind of dignity, for him at least, to simply say, well, I guess I was wrong and I sent all these people over there, and some of them got killed and it was a mistake. Incapable. One of the realities is that the British people still remain ambivalent about fully joining Europe. What they like about Europe is free trade. They like being able to ship their goods anywhere in Europe. They like that. And they like free movement. They like the fact that if you're a member of the European Union, I as an American, when I get to Europe, I got to stand in a line always, do you understand, with my passport. If you are a member of the European Union, you just sail through, you can cross any border. It's like crossing from Ohio to Michigan. So they like that free movement. In fact, many, many Europeans have come to live and work in England now because the economy is much better. Last time I was in London, there were hosts of French people, not there as tourists, they were there to work, because it's easier to get a job in England than it is to get a job in France or Germany. And one of the realities, and it's part of the politics, is now, the official estimate is 7%, most likely it's 10%. 1 out of every 10 people in England is now racially not European. And in fact, the birth rate of this sector of the population is far higher. The English have given up having babies. They just there's the theater. So they don't have a lot of them. So you can see what will happen to this population in terms of its presence. In England, there are whole towns in the Midlands, Bradford and Sheffield in particular, where the overwhelming majority of the people in the towns are not European. They are either Asian or African. It's a major alter. In America, we're sort of used to this, but for England, it's a great change. And they are a political factor. they generally overwhelmingly support the Labor Party. And they have economically benefited from some of the changes, and Blair, to his credit, and that's part of the legacy of the Labor Party, is opposed to racism, okay? Likes Maggie Thatcher's economics. See how life is a smorgasbord, do you understand? Oh, I'll pick this from the conservatives, I'll pick that from the liberal, and everybody puts together, what, his own meal. And so there it is. But meanwhile, he's in hot trouble. It's all aggravated by the election. That is, well, you won. He won. But he didn't win by any big majority this time. So in terms of his image, it was a what? It was a loss. So now everybody's dumping on, leave, 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 get out of here. Some gratitude for all I did for you. So now, the rescue. The rescue, by the way, and this is what's so delicious about the whole thing. The people who rescued Tony Blair were the French. I'm going to repeat that. The people who rescued Tony Blair were the French. How? Well, the French are now going to design a new Europe where the British better behave or they're going to get it. There's going to be a new constitution. All countries will be what merged together, from France to Belarus, who knows what. We're going to include the Ukraine. We're going to have all of Europe. And the people who run it are going to be the French. And to show our confidence in this new system, we're going to hold a referendum in France so that the French people can overwhelmingly support the new constitution. And at the head of this whole thing is President Chirac. Oh, he doesn't like the English at all. And his plan is, once we unite Europe, we will create another state that will be big enough and powerful enough and rich enough to defy the United States of America to be what? A force in its own. So, they hold the election. That's a disaster. The country that promoted this whole new system with the greatest enthusiasm, do you understand? The new Europe, the new constitution, the whole thing, are the French. And Chirac is going to depend on his French people to support him. They, by a fairly substantial majority, reject it. Reject it. Why would they reject it? Well, their great fear is that there are all these new countries which are fairly poor in Eastern Europe joining Europe. They'll need help. If they need help, maybe there won't be any money left for the French farmers or the what? The subsidies for the welfare system. I mean, no! And the main reason is Chirac and all these other people are planning the new Europe. What we're going to do is we're going to admit Turkey into the European Union. Turkey now is larger in population than any other country in Europe. It has more people than Germany, and it's growing. And all these people are exactly the people that the Europeans want. Muslims. So once you admit them into Europe, that will mean that they can all move to Paris. Oh. But, this is Chirac. It's this kind of French intellectual bureaucratic mentality. Well, I told you what the truth is, so just vote for it. Well, they voted against it, and he was crushed. They've called for his resignation. So now Europe is falling apart, right? Well, it won't go away. The free trade will still exist, and they got the euro, but the value of the euro is plummeting. It had risen. It was almost impossible to be a tourist if you were an American in Europe because the euro was so expensive. Now it's what? Now it's plummeting. So, the response to that is to call a meeting of all the leaders of the European countries. What do we do now? Not only did France reject it, but Holland, the Netherlands, which is one of the strongest supporters of the system, Holland also rejects it. The main reason being that they fear the arrival of huge numbers of Muslims, do you understand, coming out of Turkey into the country. So, they have a meeting. So Blair shows up. Does Blair like Chirac? Chirac has been denouncing the war in Iraq for a long, long time. The Americans denounced Blair as being a flunky of the Americans. So Blair shows up. And now what they have to figure out is how to rescue this whole thing. Well, in order for the Constitution to succeed, every country, every one of the 25 countries of Europe have to approve it. And 2 have already what? Rejected it. And so Blair says the following. This union is not going to work if we're going to drain the resources of one part of Europe in order to pay for the other part. And Chirac initially says, yes, that's true, because in his mind it means we shouldn't drain the resources of Western Europe to give it to Poland or Lithuania or Latvia or Estonia. Yeah. But he misunderstood Blair. What Blair was saying is the following. What we need to do is to rethink this new constitution, to rethink what's happened to Europe. If Europe is going to succeed, it needs a new economic policy. The new economic policy will do what we did in England, cut taxes and shrink the welfare system. And in fact, one of the things we need to do is to cut those subsidies that we're giving to those French farmers. Then Chirac says, never! We have a social model here in Europe created by the French and the Germans that is the social model of the future. We will not surrender to Margaret Thatcher. So the meeting breaks up. They almost hit each other in the face. So, and Blair is asked, in order to solve the economic difficulties of Europe, because the new constitution is being put in place, whether, in order to pay for all these new countries coming in who need help, he'll give up his rebate. And Blair says, okay, I'll give up my rebate if you'll give up subsidies for French farmers. And Chirac says, how insulting, how dare you speak to me? The whole thing. So the whole thing broke up in Bedlam, and now Blair, who was in trouble in England for supporting Bush in the Iraq War, do you understand? And for some of the scandals, now turns into a hero for the English. He told off the French. Now England is slated to be, Britain, the leader of Europe for 6 months. It's their turn. You take turns. And Blair has said it. What we need is to take Europe away from the incompetent hands of the French and turn it over to people who know how to run an economy. Guess who? So now, all of a sudden, poor Gordon Brown, who was expecting to become prime minister imminently, he's back waiting. Blair is again a what? The hero. He is now the champion of the new Europe, the way Europe has to be. The way Europe has to be is that they've got to get rid of that economic system that has raised the levels of unemployment to levels that are unsustainable. They have to revise the benefits. They have to revise the taxation, the whole thing. They have to get rid of most of the subsidies. That's Thatcher. And Blair is the voice of Thatcher. And now Blair, even the conservatives in England think he's a hero. He told off the French. So now, got a whole new lease on life. They've given up buying the home in the Bahamas. Maybe she'll have another baby. That worked very nice for the press, Mrs. Blair, the whole thing. And so he's rescued. And now you know where he's going to go. He's going to go sailing with this. The Iraq War, yes. Hopefully we can withdraw the British in a little while. Who knows? Now the issue is Europe. Europe is in trouble. The constitution designed by the French was rejected. So now the English are going to lead a whole coalition of people to try and save Europe. Redesign the economy so it will be strong. Oh. Now, who can believe that the British would end up as the leaders of redesigning Europe? They were sort of, on the sidelines. The French, I cannot tell you. There are private reports that Chirac has already begun to chew rugs. I mean, he's like over, finished, the whole thing. And I started out with talking about the war between the English and the French. I'll end up talking about the war between the English and the French. The war between the English and the French has ended up in the magical rescue of, at least temporarily, of Tony Blair. And thank you all very much for your attention. And have a great, I'll see you in August. Great.